Almost a year ago, I posted a video of the making of this aquascape. 2 months after it was made, the aquarium looked like this. And this is the aquarium after 9 months. This is how the aquascape is looking now. Welcome to the Undr Life. In this video, I'm going to share about the #1 factor that I think was responsible for the turnaround, and how I'm actually saving money now compared to when this tank was a complete disaster. You'd think that having a nicer aquascape always costs more money, but I'll show you how you might be able to have a nicer aquascape by actually spending less. The key lies with this, these heavy jugs of fertilizer. Or actually, in getting away from this fertilizer. When I started this tank, I began by dosing according to the instructions on the bottle. These are the same fertilizers as I was just holding up, just smaller package. The tank did great for the first 3 months or so, but over time, the health of it just kept declining. I tested the water and found that I couldn't detect any of the fertilizer that I was putting in. I figured this could potentially be a reason why the plants weren't doing so well. And when plants don't do well, algae thrives. They say the best way to combat algae is with good plant health. So I decided to start upping the dose of the fertilizer until hopefully I would start detecting it in the water. As I went, I kept record of each dose increase on some sticky notes that I had right by the tank. And I started off doing 1.5 milliliters twice a week, which is what the bottle recommended. And then I started doing 1.5 milliliters per day instead of twice a week. And then I started doing 2 milliliters per day, 3, 4, 5, up and up. And I just couldn't detect it in the water. Eventually, the dose I was giving the tank was so much higher than what's recommended on the bottle that I was getting nervous and thinking, maybe I'm dosing way too much, and I was basing this dose mainly on my phosphate test. I decided to test the phosphate kit in case the phosphate kit was wrong. I took a test tube of water from the tank and put a drop or two of the phosphate fertilizer right into the test tube and then tested that to see if phosphate showed up. And the phosphate showed up, so clearly the test could at least measure phosphate in the water, and it was just measuring nothing in this tank. There's a lot of plants in this aquarium, so I figured that the plants were probably just consuming all of the fertilizer that I was putting in. But the amount of fertilizer that I started putting in a single dose was so high that I started becoming nervous for my fish. So even if the plants were consuming that amount throughout the day, if I dose way over the recommended amount once a day, there's going to be a huge spike in the fertilizers. I decided to get an auto doser, and this would dose the tank automatically multiple times throughout the day and spread it out. Also save me time because I had been starting to dose twice a day, and it's just a pain in the butt to have to remember that. I installed this and my tank became not really an aquarium anymore, more like a robot with fish in it. I also found that I was running out of the small bottles super fast, so this is when I bought the giant jugs. If you know Seachem fertilizers, you'll know that they have each nutrient in its own bottle, and that really allows you to dial in if you decide, okay, I have enough potassium, but I need more nitrates. You can just dose more nitrates. And I had 1 nutrient on each line of the doser. You can have 4 different nutrients. I was having to dose 4 different fertilizers twice a day, big pain in the butt. And this really saved me. What it didn't save me though is money, because this quickly became the most expensive part of my aquarium upkeep by far. I also added root tabs at this time because I figured that if nutrition was a problem and it was fine at first, it might be because the aqua soil had all the nutrients it needed when I first set up the tank, but over time those nutrients were used up. They needed to be refreshed with root tabs. With tons of fertilizer now going in on a steady, consistent basis, I did see some turnaround in the plants, especially the moss, and it was a sign that something was was happening. Unfortunately, algae kept encroaching on the new growth. To have a fighting chance, I figured that I might need to just replace all of the plants, pull out everything that was struggling and give them a fresh new start without so much algae that they have to compete with. So I pulled out the whole Monte Carlo carpet, I pulled out most of the stem plants, and I started over with a lot of new plants, and things were looking pretty good after I did that. After replacing the plants, I thought maybe CO2 was the main culprit, so I was really focusing on that, and I actually kept the nutrients pretty low after replacing them. I also added new aqua soil and put a lot of root tabs in there. It was about half new aqua soil, and I was hoping that the aqua soil could keep up with the nutrient demand and all those root tabs, and I wouldn't need to add so much fertilizer. I was still a little bit suspicious of adding so much more than the bottle calls for. Just like before, I started seeing the plant health going down again. It was healthy when it first was planted. It was drawing nutrients from the soil, but things started declining. And I was trying multiple things, and I went back to adding the fertilizer in again. I went back to a huge dose. And this time I decided to actually calculate the concentrations. I followed some online suggestions for how much of each nutrient should be detected in the water, and that's measured in parts per million. And I found that the phosphate concentration in the phosphate fertilizer was especially low. So when I did these calculations, I realized I need 15 milliliters per day, which is wild because they recommend something around 1.5 milliliters twice a week, like I said. So that's just way, way over what they recommend. And I thought, all right, well, I'll try putting in that concentration. I was putting in, I think, 15 milliliters of phosphate, 15 of potassium, 2, I think, of nitrogen, because the Seachem nitrogen is more concentrated, and my tank also doesn't seem to deplete the nitrogen as quickly. And then I was adding some iron. Altogether, that's about 35 milliliters of fertilizer per day. For the first time, I saw the plants not only start having new growth and thriving, but I saw algae getting brown and dying, and it was really cool that algae was there, but getting sickly. I feel like that's the holy grail, that's the dream when you're struggling with an algae issue for so long, is to see the plants thriving and the algae actually dying. For the longest time, it was the reverse. Unfortunately, as you can imagine, dosing 35 milliliters a day is pretty expensive. Now I was starting to run out of the big jug quickly, and that jug cost quite a bit. I needed 4 of them. This led me to think, okay, I probably need to switch my fertilizer and find something that's more concentrated. And some of the recommended dosing that I had been going off of came from a company called 2 Hour Aquarist. And their dosing recommendations fall pretty in line with other things that you'll see recommended. I knew that they have their own line of fertilizers, and if they're recommending dosing this much fertilizer, their fertilizer must be more concentrated, I would think. So I took a look at their concentrations of their nutrients in the fertilizer, and it looked great, much, much better. A single bottle of this is twice as expensive as a single bottle of this, but it's several times more concentrated, so it's actually cheaper per bottle for what you get. And then it's also an all-in-one, so you get all of the nutrients in one bottle instead of having to buy 4 or 5 or whatever bottles of the Seachem. The cost of it and the ease swayed me, so I decided to try it and try something new with my aquarium that I had just gotten balanced, which is a risk. And I was nervous about this because, like I said, it tends to not need as much nitrogen in my tank. And the nitrogen in this is a little higher than what I was dosing. The gamble worked, and now instead of dosing 35 milliliters a day, I just dose 1 milliliter of fertilizer a day. That comes down to me spending 15 times less on fertilizer per day than the Seachem. Since the new fertilizer is an all-in-one, that also means that it frees up the other lines of the doser, so I can dose fertilizers to other tanks on this shelf. I'm going to be dosing to this one soon. If you look in the app for my doser, and yes, it has an app, it shows the amount of days I have left for this fertilizer. And you can see there's quite a lot of days here. It's over 400 days, and this has been running for a number of months with this fertilizer already. It's worth saying that the 2-hour Aquarist fertilizers aren't the only that come as all-in-one. I know Leaf Zone is one. There's Easy Green from Aquarium Co-op. And honestly, I didn't look into the concentrations of those. Those might also be high and something that I should look into in the future. There's also other ways to get really high concentrations of fertilizers for really cheap. So the fertilizer that I'm using in this tank is called APT-E, and the E stands for estimative index, which is a common thing that people are doing where they'll usually buy their own dry salt minerals and mix the fertilizers themselves, and you can get an insane value for that. It's such a small tank, it's probably not worth the effort. If I had a huge, like 100-gallon tank or something, definitely I would be looking into that. As far as the Seachem fertilizers, the main possible reason I could see that you might still want to use this is if you want to dose specific nutrients, more of one and less of another. And you don't want to go the complicated route of doing estimative index. You want a kind of simple way of dosing specific things. And I say simple, but it's really kind of not that simple, because if you want to be simple, it's an all-in-one, but it may be an intermediate step between this and estimative index, and you don't care how much money you're spending. I could see for myself potentially in the future, if my all-in-one fertilizer is just not quite in balance with what I need, I would probably do the all-in-one to get that baseline across all of the fertilizers, across all of the nutrients, and then just add a little bit of this for whatever nutrient is lacking. Actually, another use case for the Seachem would be if you just aren't dosing a lot of fertilizer and you don't have an aquarium that's very nutrient hungry. So that might be if you just don't have a lot of plants in there, or if somehow your aquarium balance is such that you can get away with not having a lot of fertilizers detectable in the water. I recently watched a video from Green Aqua, and they showed their water parameters, what they usually use. And I was surprised to find that a lot of the nutrients are at zero detectable in the water. And that just didn't work for this aquarium. It just didn't work for me. A lot of people don't do it that way, but somehow it works for them. At this point, you might be watching the video and saying, hey, I clicked on this video because I wanted to find like the one main factor that would fix my aquarium, and you're muddying the water with other methodologies, and you're saying do a lot of fertilizer, but other people aren't doing a lot of fertilizer, and maybe it's confusing. And I've actually made a separate video about why you can't actually rely on just one fix, on just one factor. And this was the factor that worked best for me. It's what this aquarium needed the most. But there's actually a better, broader methodology that I think we can all use. So there's a box link over here that you can click to go to that video, and I'm a little biased because I made it, but I highly recommend it. I think that it's a great companion video to this one. Just a bonus side note here, the second most thing that this aquarium seems to need and that affects it the most is CO2. If the CO2 drops for any reason, even if the aquarium has been super healthy, it'll quickly show a difference. At times I had really high CO2, but the fertilizer wasn't good and it didn't help. And at times I've had the fertilizer really high, but not enough CO2, that didn't help either. So those definitely need to be factored together. And then I'd say third most important in this tank has been getting the water flow right, and getting the CO2 especially and the nutrients to circulate in the tank around and to have access to all parts, all corners. And really when it comes down to it, the CO2 is often considered a nutrient, and the flow is also a way of distributing those nutrients. So it's all nutrient based. It has a lot of plants, and I think that makes it just a super nutrient hungry little ecosystem. Thanks for watching. I hope this video gave you some ideas to consider when it comes to aquarium fertilization and can save you some money in the future toward the part that we all love most, setting up that next tank. See you later.